Hi, everyone. Welcome to another workshop presented to you by the Writing Support Center. My name is Genesis. I'm one of the faculty here at the Writing Support Center. And today we're continuing on with our new and improved series where we go back to some of our early workshops and revamp them for your convenience. And today we're talking about working through writing anxiety. So before we get started, to help you get the most out of this workshop, we do ask that you complete the accompanying activity worksheet. This worksheet is particularly helpful because it just helps you process some of the information that we are going to discuss today. And if you're completing the workshop as a class assignment or for extra credit, the worksheet is for you to show to your professor that you watched the video to its entirety. We also ask you to take your time. Feel free to pause and rewind parts that were confusing or went too fast. That's the beauty of these virtual workshops is that you can really do them on your own time. So feel free to take your time with them. An overview of today's agenda. So we're going to be discussing what are writing anxiety and writer's block. What are some things that trigger writer's block? Strategies for you to use when you are encountering those feelings of feeling stuck. And then we'll also have some reflection activities throughout the workshop today. And then finally, we'll end with the summary of what we discussed. Right. So, what are writing anxiety and writer's block? These are two names for a very similar experience, and they are informal terms to describe a pessimistic or uneasy feeling towards writing. So, oftentimes when we feel stuck on a paper or we feel like we don't want to start it, we're waiting till the last minute to start it because um, we just don't want to do it. Oftentimes, this is a result of us feeling uncomfortable with the writing, us not feeling 100% confident in our skills. And this is because writing anxiety is learned and situational and can often be the result of a bad experience with writing, such as constantly receiving negative feedback in the past or being told that writing isn't your thing. So writing anxiety and writer's block are actually very common experiences that a lot of college students experience throughout their careers, and it can be particularly frustrating because writing is such a um, transferable skill. We encounter writing in all different forms, so when we feel anxiety with writing, sometimes it could be deterring in a class. But one thing to keep in mind is that it doesn't apply to all types of writing. On the contrary, your comfort levels may vary depending on the discipline or the assignment. So, for example, if you are a STEM major, you're in the STEM sciences, you might be more comfortable writing lab reports because that is the type of writing that you encounter most often. But then when you're writing for, if you're taking a sociology class and you have to put together some sort of uh, research or social sciences essay, that might feel a little more unnerving or a little harder just because it's a different type of writing than what you are used to. So one thing to keep in mind is that your this feeling of discomfort might not always be there with writing, but it's okay if you're feeling this way because um, everyone experiences it, but also it's just honoring that part of yourself that feels that discomfort. But we'll be talking about ways that you can move past that discomfort so that way you can finish your assignments with um, in, as little stress as possible. So before we move forward, we're going to have you do a reflection activity that is found in the accompanying worksheet in the module. And for this reflection, I just want you to think about, are there certain writing assignments that feel intimidating to start? It's if so, what makes them feel intimidating? So take some time to think about that. What are those writing assignments that feel hard to do, and why? So we've discussed what writing anxiety and writer's block are, but when do these feelings arise? And there's a multitude of reasons that can trigger these emotions when we're writing. The first is a learning curve. So sometimes when we're adjusting to a new form of writing, that can cause stress just because it's out of our comfort zones. We're not 100% used to them. Sometimes we might be trying to make sure that we're meeting all the requirements or writing in the right form. So all of that can cause us to feel stuck. It can cause that fear of the blank page, that fear to start writing. And so that learning curve can help trigger writing anxiety. Uh, another situation that can trigger these feelings is previous negative critique or overly critical readers. So we tend to internalize negative feedback, and if you have gotten a lot of previous negative feedback in the past, that can definitely be something that we carry throughout our academic journeys and into classes, and into the different classes that we're taking. Even if that reader is no longer there, you know, that teacher from second grade is no longer present in your life, they're no longer reading your assignments, yet their feedback is still present within us. So, um, when we're trying to write, sometimes we hear that inner critic, and it's the critic that from our past. So that could be another triggering factor. Sometimes it could also just be that you currently have a very critical instructor, or you have really critical classmates and you're doing peer reviews. So we we fear that overly critical feedback. And while constructive criticism is really productive and can help us grow as writers, when we receive only criticism without the balance of um, positivity or the strengths that we do have in our writing, it can be very deterring and make us not want to write. Another situation that can trigger these feelings are time management. So having too little time, or having too much unstructured time can lead to that procrastination and those feelings of feeling blocked and stressed. When you have too little time, it can make you feel pressured. So, you know, you've worked out your schedule and you have all of your life events happening, and suddenly you realize you only really have a couple days or a couple hours here and there to work on your essay. That can make you feel really stressed because, you know, ideally you would want more time. Um, so of course, like that's going to cause you to feel like you don't really want to get started or just make you feel blocked in terms of your writing. And then likewise, when you have too much unstructured time, sometimes that can lead to procrastination as well because you just have so much time on your hands that you feel like, oh, I can put it off till tomorrow, or I can do this later. And before you realize, suddenly the paper's due the next day and you're staying up till 3 a.m. to finish it. So, you know, just learning that time management could be a really big factor of how to prevent these feelings from coming up. Another situation that can stir up these feelings of disinterest or not wanting to write or feeling blocked or stressed is not having any interest in the topic. We're less likely to want to work on an assignment if it doesn't relate to our academic or our life goals. So those kinds of situations will definitely feel us make us want to feel like we want to put it off. We don't want to do it. We're going to feel stuck. So sometimes it helps to talk to your instructor and see if there's any other ways that you can maybe spice up the assignment so that way it appeals to you a little more. And then finally, another situation that can cause these feelings to arise are outside stressors. So um, as students, you are more than just a student. You have a life that occurs outside of school, and sometimes those life events can affect our focus and our ability to work because our attention is somewhere else, and that is totally fine. That is completely valid. um in the past year we've had a pandemic that's still ongoing, and so that can affect the way that you approach school. It can affect the way that you are able to focus on school if you have to provide for your family, and make sure that everyone is meeting having their basic needs met. Of course, school is going to be the last thing on your mind, and even more so that paper for that one class. So all of these factors can contribute to feeling blocked, or like not wanting to work on an assignment, or feeling anxious towards an assignment. So, what do we do when we're feeling these feelings of stress, these feelings of anxiety, feeling blocked when it comes to writing? There's a couple different strategies, and we're going to go over six of them today. And the first is getting support. So, one of the misconceptions about writing is that writing is a solitary act. But on the contrary, some of the best writers actually worked in community. They had a group of people that they relied on, a group of people that they turned to when they felt stuck, and they really wrote in community rather than writing in isolation. So choose a writing buddy. This could be either a classmate, it could be a tutor, it could be a friend, etc. And talk to them about your worries, ideas, writing process, and your successes, and just really try to build that camaraderie. And that way you won't feel as alone, and when you get stuck, you're able to have someone to talk to. Um, we also recommend joining a writing group or creating a writing group within your class. And this way, you're able to provide each other with deadlines, ask one another if they have some time to read over your work and provide feedback, and support and constructive criticism. Uh, and again, it might also be a good idea to set up sort of some guidelines for that writing group. What does constructive feedback look like for all of you? Um, and what is okay, what is not okay, and then making sure that everyone in the group is adhering to those guidelines. Again, isolation can harm writers, particularly those working on long assignments, because when you're working by yourself, you're more likely to lose motivation. Whereas when you work with others, you grow with others and you work in that collaborative environment. Another strategy for handling these types of feelings is identifying your strengths. So we are often our own worst critics, and we are always going to see the ways that we are quote unquote failing, or the ways that we could always get better, but not in a constructive way, but rather just focusing on our deficits, on our weaknesses, and seeing ourselves from that weakness point of view. So it's really helpful to identify your strengths, so that way when you do fall into that loop of, oh, I'm just not a good writer, or like, what's the point in writing this if I'm just going to get another bad grade, make a list of the things that you do well, um, and refer back to that list when these feelings are coming up. And because sometimes we are our own worst critics, it can be helpful to ask a friend for help. Like, what have they seen out of your writing? Or if there's a professor that you trust, asking them, what did you see my strengths were in my writing? Some suggestions on what this would look like include: I explain things well to people. I get people's interest. I have strong opinions. I listen well. I am critical of what I read. I see connections. And then choosing at least one strength as your starting point. So that way, when you're thinking, I can't write, saying, I am a writer who can explain things well to people. Um, that way, you're seeing yourself from a strength standpoint rather than a weakness standpoint. Another strategy to handle these feelings of anxiety or feeling of writer's block is recognizing that writing is a complex process. Um, with writing, you are trying to create meaning on a page through words. And sometimes that involves taking meaning from something that you've read, forming your own ideas, and then trying to explain those ideas to an audience that you cannot see. So you're putting it down on paper and trying to make sure that you're explaining it as thoroughly as possible. And that is a hard thing to do. Um, which is part of the reason why we don't always see really strong, like, that is part of the reason why we have to vet sort of the things that we read, because not everyone is constructing an argument well. And that's okay. Writing takes years of practice, and it takes honing that skill. One other thing to keep in mind is that writing is a skill, and because it's a skill, you're not just learning it in a vacuum. You're not just learning writing in one class. You're learning writing in a variety of different ways. So you want to recognize that because it's a complex process, it's going to be hard, and it's going to sometimes make you feel um, inadequate, but we are here for you, um, as a means of helping you get better. Um, Another thing to keep in mind is that obstacles with writing and getting your ideas out are where learning occurs. So when you are feeling um, down, or when you feel you didn't get as good of a grade on a paper as you had hoped, really trying to see of like what is the learning that you can take away from, what can you improve in your next assignment. So be comfortable with being uncomfortable, because that is usually what happens when you're learning. You're being put in discomfort because your growth is happening, those growing pains. Also view yourself as an apprentice. So block and uneasiness occurs when you're encountering something new, either a new audience, new writing format, subject. So you always want to see yourself as someone who's learning, someone who's always growing, rather than as like a master. I myself have a master's in writing in English, and I still see myself as a student, because if I were to think of myself as like, oh, my learning is done, I wouldn't be allowing that opportunity for myself to grow. And it would be easier for me to get stuck, because if I get stuck, rather than seeing myself as someone who's learning, if I see myself as a master, I'm thinking like I should know this because I've done this for so long. But no, we're all students and we're all still learning and growing. And this is that opportunity to learn and grow. Viewing yourself as an apprentice or someone who's learning is an opportunity to treat things as a test trial. So, trying to learn as much as you can, gain as many new skills as possible, and reflect on how it can help you in the future. Another strategy for when you're feeling blocked, stressed, or anxious is trying something new. So identify where you get stuck and seek advice from others to see what they do to get unstuck during that stage. Um, Again, we do our best learning in community, so seeing what others do can be really helpful for our own growth. And sometimes it's not even reaching out to friends or classmates or professors. Sometimes it's also seeking to the internet. So finding out handouts, workshop videos, online resources to help out with strategies for brainstorming, revision, writing, just to see what are the different things that you can try. And again, thinking of yourself as that apprentice, as that student, and seeing what new ways you can learn. And one of the most important ones, celebrate your successes. So it's so easy to focus on the negative and focus on what we don't do well, but we also need to focus on the positive. So celebrate and take pride when you overcome a difficult situation. And that overcoming can look in a lot of different ways. So sometimes just finishing the paper is a big accomplishment, and give yourself props for that. You are the one who defines what success means to you, and success doesn't always mean getting an A on the paper. Sometimes success is just finishing the paper in the first place and turning it in on time, or just turning it in at all. Other times it's getting a C on the paper because on your previous essay you got a D. So a C is a huge improvement. You're the one who decides what success means, and so celebrate when you see yourself improving. A suggestion to help remind you of your successes is keep a log or a journal of the times that you've experienced success to reference to for you to reference when you feel challenged. How did it feel when you achieved it? What was the process that you took to achieve it? So that way, when you are feeling those challenges, when you are feeling those feelings, you're able to go back, see what you did in the past, and try to replicate it or try something new. And um, the final tip that we have is get support. And yes, I know we've already mentioned it, but it's so important that we're mentioning it twice. Again, community is a source of empowerment, and can help you remember your strengths. And if you're new to college and you're not sure whom you can reach out to, that's totally fine. We are here to support you. You can reach out to professors that seem nice, your academic counselor that you've been assigned, classmates. Our writing support center tutors are always happy to help out and be that support. Um, you have a variety of people just here at PCC that are more than happy to help you. Personal counselors can also help with anxiety outside of writing. So if you notice that you're feeling um, this type of stress that is blocking you from writing or blocking you from doing any assignment at all, feel free to reach out to personal counseling. They are another great resource for you. So now we're going to go and do another reflection activity that you can complete on the accompanying worksheet. And think about the different strategies that we've talked about today, and which strategy are you likely to try the next time you're experiencing writer's block or writing anxiety, and how come? What makes this strategy appealing to you and why it's one that you want to try out? So, in summary, one, remember that you are not alone. Feeling uneasy or uncomfortable with writing is a really common feeling across college campuses because writing is one of the main forms of communication and processing knowledge, and you are going to be doing it in a variety of ways in school. So it's completely okay that you were feeling this. There's no shame in feeling this. Writing is a hard skill to uh, learn, and to do well. So cut yourself some slack, and be open to learning from these experiences, especially because negative experiences will happen, precisely because writing is a process and practice that takes time to get skilled at. So choose a suggestion or a piece of feedback and try to improve on it in the next paper. So that's always another tip that you can do is if you're getting a lot of feedback, try to see if there's one that particularly stands out to you and focus on improving that in the future. So, for example, if you get an essay back with a lot of different comments, uh, and one of them is elaborating more on your quotes, maybe that would be something that you focus on in your next paper. And then the paper after that, you can focus on something else. So that way you're really building upon the skill. Uh, and finally, remember that these are not failures, but rather learning experiences. Learning often occurs in the wake of a startling event, or something that uh, just shocks you or makes you wonder. So use these quote unquote failures to keep moving. They're an opportunity to learn, because no failure is a true failure. it's an opportunity for us to learn, reflect, and grow. We have a couple references that you're more than welcome to look at if you want to learn more about writing anxiety and ways to navigate that feeling of being blocked or stressed when it comes to writing. One is the Writing Anxiety post by the Writing Center at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. This workshop was adapted from their handout on writing anxiety, and it provides additional strategies for additional strategies and questions for self-reflection. There's a book called Understanding Writing Blocks, where the author talks about their experiences working with university students experiencing block, and it could be a really great source for you for undergraduate writers or new writers or just anyone. And lastly, When a Writer Can't Write, Studies in Writer's Block and Other Composing Process Problems is another great book that has more data into it as a focus on writing teachers, researchers, and tutors, and how they work with writer's block and what triggers writer's blocks to them. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye, everyone.